I'm the Dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. We're delighted to have you here for what I know will be an informative and enlightening presentations by really one of the great scholars of Miami-Dade. If you've lived in South Florida as long as I have, and I've been here for 40 years, you have seen more changes than you can count, some good, some perhaps not so good. But whatever your opinions about the changes are, there is no doubt that this area and this city, called by some the Magic City, has undergone astounding transformation in the last 4 decades, even the last few years. We have seen neighborhoods from Little Havana to Little Haiti, West Miami to Wynwood rapidly transformed by changing demographics, changing development, and changing economics. The focus on demographics, development, and economics really will form a focal point of what Professor George is going to discuss. It's a process that many witness but few really understand in terms of its interrelationships. With us today, we have a scholar who has not only witnessed the vast transformation of Miami, he has made it his life work to understand it. I want to acknowledge, before I introduce Dr. George, I want to thank the Ruth K. and Shepherd Broads Distinguished Lecture Series and the Broad and Bustle families, the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies, the FIU Honors College, and the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, all of whom have co-sponsored today's lecture. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the Green family, whose generous gift is transforming this school and furthering our mission to create a just, peaceful, and prosperous world. I have admired Paul George's work for more than 3 decades. He's known to many as Mr. Miami History. That's true, but there's so much more. He has been a leading proponent of preserving our history through the streets and neighborhoods and the hidden gems that are all over Miami. He is professor of history at Miami-Dade College, as well as the historian at History Miami. He holds a PhD in history from Florida State, has authored 15 books and nearly 200 articles, books, reviews, and columns. He has won numerous awards for his work, including Miami's Outstanding Historian, Historian of the Year, and the Best of Miami. Paul, we're so pleased to have you with us. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Paul George.
Thanks so much, John. I appreciate it. Delighted to be back here, too. And you mentioned the Broad family that's sponsored so much here at FIU, and we lost Morris Broad, who was really the life spark for a series of lectures, including this one. He passed away just in the last couple of weeks. A lovely man. We had lunch together last year when I presented another lecture, and I just wanted to remember him, too. He was really special. I'm here today to talk about gentrification, which is a really hot topic, and I wanted to look at gentrification specifically as it applies to the Magic City, which incidentally was Miami's nickname from about August of 1896 on, which was a month after incorporation, through today. Nothing is very enduring in Miami, but that nickname is the one thing that has gone through 120 years. We still hear it at times. Some people call it the Tragic City, but I'm going to call it the Magic City. And I just wanted to then look at this, and before I begin my remarks, we have a map up on the wall, and we're going to be looking at a corridor of neighborhoods and how they've changed over time and the impact of gentrification on these neighborhoods. And for the most part, they're the older neighborhoods in Miami, beginning with Brickell south of the river, going through downtown, Overtown, Wynwood, Buena Vista Design District, Little Haiti, Little River, and then we're going to go over to the Biscayne Boulevard corridor and bring that down a little bit. And as one final look, I'm going to give you a sneak preview of the next hot area for gentrification, Alapata. These are some of the things I want to address today, and I wanted to look at the term gentrification It's usually attributed to a British sociologist, Ruth Glass, who introduced the term, we believe, in a 1964 essay. She was a Marxist. She was distressed to see that, as she wrote, the working class quarters of London have been invaded by the middle classes. And as the gentry moved in, the proletariat moved out, and again, her words, until all or most of the original working class occupiers are displaced and the whole social character of the district is changed. Glass and others have noted that as older neighborhoods often passed over in the rush of suburbia, or at least something new became more desirable, their original culture was being displaced, if not destroyed. The gentrification chronology on a global or at least a Western scale included, though it varied from place to place, the following phases. And I want to look at these phases through somewhat of a jocular article that came out recently in the Miami New Times, in which the writer listed the various phases of gentrification. And of course, there's always a hint of irreverence in almost everything that's presented in Miami New Times, and you can see it here. But I think to a large degree, they, he, she got it right. For the New Times, they broke down the stages into about 6 phases. Phase 1 of the gentrification process saw people moving into a soon-to-be transitional neighborhood in quest of cheap rent. South Beach in the early 80s, Wynwood in the early 00s. Some of the people who came in were, as the writer put it, underpaid creatives. By then, there were a couple of rogue art galleries in that neighborhood. There was no established nightlife scene yet, though occasional parties popped up at those art galleries or elsewhere. New business activity was minimal in phase 1. A food truck or two may show up occasionally. And really, this description fits Wynwood so beautifully in the early 2000s. And then phase 2, as the writer saw, would see friends of the early renters moving in, and the gallery scene was growing, and nightlife was still shaky, but real estate was beginning to pick up. And homes were being painted in funky ways. Craft beers were beginning to appear, and a new restaurant or two with a pseudo-celebrity chef was bravely opened. And again, I could see this in Wynwood. I know the Goldman family, and Joey Goldman came up to me about 2008, I believe. They had a lot of property then, trying to turn the place around. He opened up Joey's. And I thought to myself, boy, what a chance that is. Down on about 26th Street, Northwest 2nd Avenue. And he said, I've hired 2 great chefs. All I want to do is break even, to bring people into the quarter. And Joey's, at least until Zika, has done fabulous. And then phase 3 is marked by people with, quote, real money who are starting to make moves. Developers are taking notice, and the Miami Herald runs a front page article on the changing neighborhood. Art galleries have expanded in such numbers that a monthly art walk has been introduced. And if you've been to that second Saturday art walk in Wynwood, you get a sense of how wild and crazy it is. A bar has opened. Developers and investors are beginning to buy up properties, while warehouses are converted for other purposes. Rents are rising slowly but steadily, and older residents are beginning to be priced out as kids in acid-wash jeans keep moving in. And then there's phase 4. Old neighborhood restaurants, the old neighborhood restaurants are always booked, but by the new breed resident or by outsiders. That doesn't quite fit the Wynwood experience, because the old neighborhood restaurants were really north of 29th Street, and they had been initially Puerto Rican. Today, just general Hispanic restaurants, just mom and pops, greasy spoons. But in phase 4 also, nightlife has really picked up, but now older buildings are being torn down. Big investors have moved in and are buying large chunks of property while city government meetings are convened to discuss the need to rezone the neighborhood. Well, we can see what's happened with Buena just in recent days and weeks with his proposed development. Phase 5, both the original and transitional character of the neighborhood are gone or fading away, and most of the art galleries have left, priced out. Nightlife is robust as people from other hip neighborhoods are Ubering up to this quarter for bar crawls. Real estate-wise, the neighborhood sees its first mixed-use mid-rise towers happening in Wynwood, and has happened there. Someone who has judged an episode of Chopped opens a restaurant. Phase 6, and this is the writer, ugh, this neighborhood is like so over now, end quote. So much of its uniqueness and authenticity is gone. After all, a Gap store has opened, as has a P.F. Chang's. And there is a, quote, veritable skyline full of luxury high-rises, end quote. While people keep buying units for astounding prices, no one seems to live in them. Well, that's as far as they got with that gentrification move. I think that there's other ingredients to the picture, and I think what I would have done had I written the article, I would have added a couple other requirements for gentrification. And again, it's not just a Miami phenomenon, it's all over the country, it's in many parts of the Western world and elsewhere. And I would have said that I think one of the things important for gentrification, in addition to what was mentioned here, was the neighborhood should have a good strategic location. And I'm thinking of Wynwood again, as well as a culturally interesting environment. And I'm thinking of Wynwood again in that respect. Kinds of neighborhoods. Often neighborhoods under change are minority neighborhoods, which will be replaced by predominantly white population. But the process really is more nuanced, more layered than that. And minorities themselves can play a role here in this process, not just as maybe people victims of it. For example, a large gay population led to the gentrification of San Francisco's Castro Street decades ago. Closer to home, the neighborhoods of budding Biscayne Boulevard's Mimo district from about 77th down to about 50th Street began experiencing gentrification well over 30 years ago. In the case of Belmead or Palm Grove, large gay populations moved in and began to really fix up some really striking real estate to begin with that had really fallen in hard times. And then there's the backside of gentrification. Displacement, rising rents and prices, property values and taxes going up. Gentrification then, of course, leads to this for a lot of people through the demolition of older housing stock, through rising rents, through home prices going up, taxes rising. Displacement also means, besides perhaps being pushed out of the place, and as a result of that means loss of community and even the peculiar culture of the old neighborhood. And examples of this consequence are legion. You can pick up a newspaper, New York Times, and you can see it again and again. These articles are very frequent. Pick up a Times or a magazine or a journal or go to YouTube. There's all kind of documentaries on it. And you'll find a plethora of stories on this topic. Item. Recently, New York Times, a retail sector of mom and pop stores in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood is closing quickly as new development and soaring rents overtake the area. Item, the siliconization, my word, of San Francisco continues despite rising protests as more and more high-tech millionaires move into the city, pushing up rents and prices in general and exuding privilege. After all, Google sends out a bus to pick up these folks and then bring them back from work. People have protested that. There, the minority populations of low earnings have shrunk significantly in San Francisco, but also the middle class is being priced out of one of the priciest cities in America. Item, a black middle-class community on Sag Harbor Hills on the edge of the Hamptons, tracing its roots to the period immediately after World War II, fears that multiple purchases in recent times in that neighborhood by faceless LLCs will compromise a special enclave whose inhabitants date from the period of its inception. Item, the once forlorn industrial waterfront of Sunset Park on the western edge of Brooklyn, where environmental gains and viable smaller businesses now are in the crosshairs of big money threatening through an ambitious redevelopment plan featuring big box stores, restaurants, and residential towers to run off the venerable businesses already there with possible adverse consequences for about 12,000 workers. And the list goes on. Well, let's look at Miami within the context of all this. Few cities in America have experienced in the past 14 years 2 real estate building booms of the scale seen in this area. Miami, and this may surprise some folks here, now has the 3rd densest skyline in the United States after New York and Chicago. And parts of the results or consequences of these explosive building booms has been a radical transformation of many neighborhoods. Miami offers, I think, as many good examples of gentrification as probably any city in America. So let's look at the transformation of older center city neighborhoods. And the term center city, I think, is more of a state of mind than it's a geographical term, because after all, if we get up to above Little Haiti or Little River, we're about 5 miles north of the center of Miami, the historical center anyway, but it's considered a inner city neighborhood, or maybe we can call it a center city neighborhood. It goes back to the fact my folks came from Philadelphia and everything there was center city, center city. So let's look then at the transformation of some of these neighborhoods. And until the recent past, the transformation of South Beach in the Art Deco District was not only the most prominent example of gentrification in Miami, but it was about the only example at that time. So let's look at South Beach. in terms of its gentrification. Like the Castro District of San Francisco or the Mimo area flanking Biscayne Boulevard, South Beach offers a different example. Here was elderly, primarily Jewish settlers who moved into the great Art Deco hotels of the 1930s and early 40s. Nobody knew it was great then. After that quarter was replaced as a prime tourist destination by the post-World War II development of Mid Beach, that would be the 30s and beyond, and then North Beach as you go up that corridor. Let's hand it to Barbara Kaplan, the Grand Dame of the Art Deco District, long deceased, and the band of zany zealots that she organized in the mid-1970s, who discovered in these fading buildings down there in South Beach, very quiescent area at the time, the great details that speak to the Art Deco or streamlined modern style of architecture. One day in June of 1976, Barbara and her son John, who was a professor of social work, and Leonard Horowitz, her friend from the world of design, who also worked as a bellboy at the Fontainebleau Hotel, which itself was on the brink of bankruptcy in the late 1970s, strolled through the future Art Deco district in the Flamingo Park neighborhood west of Ocean Drive, of course. Following the walk, Barbara remarked, quote, "Maybe these lovely buildings could be used to save the people who live in them," end quote. Soon after, she had organized the Miami Design Preservation League to push the case for historic designation of this unique collection of Art Deco style buildings, said to be the largest assemblage of that style in the world, and to promote, publicize, and even restore that quarter. In May 1979, the Department of the Interior designated a large area stretching from 6th to 23rd Street from the Atlantic Ocean irregularly west over to Lenox Court as a national architectural and historic district. And we can see the lower part of the beach here. Again, 6th here, all the way to 23rd. And you might wonder, why not below 6? Well, we're going to address that very shortly. So you've got an Art Deco district at this point. It's a district that includes over 1,000 buildings with some features, some buildings with many features of the Art Deco style, rounded contours, eyebrows, friezes, steel casement windows, parapets, horizontal lines, vertical lines, all of these with a lot of meaning to them. And yet investment only trickled in the last half, until the last half of the 1980s into the Art Deco district. So it was really touch and go for many of those early years after it became a national district. Finally, in, I think, the magical year of 1988, led by Tony Goldman, who had great success in New York Soho, south of Houston Street in New York City, began to buy up and restore properties in the Art Deco district. And he recruited people to come down and open businesses like Mark Soika, who in the magical turnaround year, at least for me, 1988, opened up the News Cafe on Ocean Drive. We were talking about that at lunch today, John, in fact, the News Cafe on the eve of Hurricane Andrew. Early on, Kaplan and the Miami Design Preservation League realized that the preservation efforts that they had undertaken now of a decade plus could result in gentrification and the attendant dislocation of many elderly residents of these old buildings on Ocean Drive and elsewhere, if steps were not taken to mitigate the process. Accordingly, the Miami Design Preservation League, itself founded in 1976, founded in 1981 something called the Miami Beach Development Corporation. And this organization succeeded in using historic preservation funds and tax credits, as well as city, county, and state affordable housing funds and processes to create several hundred affordable housing options in renovated structures in the National Register District on South Beach for the large elderly population that remained there and who had lived in these fading hotels on a year-round basis with limited means. South Beach and its Art Deco district quickly became one of the nation's hotspots as investment poured in and the rich, beautiful, and famous became steady visitors to its restored hotels, its pricey restaurants, its flourishing clubs. Now, each neighborhood in greater Miami that has experienced and is experiencing gentrification has displayed different characteristics, some of which would be common to the Art Deco district, some maybe not seen in the Art Deco district. And in fact, even in the Art Deco district, there are different elements of this story and process. And I think that Lincoln Road is a great example to point to. Today, one of America's most popular promenades, Lincoln Road's revival was a result of the initial spate of restoration and the turnaround in the Art Deco district, which it was a part. In other words, a ripple effect of Ocean Drive and other areas would eventually impact on Lincoln Road and really transform it to what it is today. But its turnaround came later than that of Ocean Drive and other parts of the district. This once proud shopping area was in sharp decline by the 1970s and remained so into the 1980s. And then the artists came in, filling spaces through the South Florida Arts Center and an old Art Deco style Burrows at 800 Lincoln Road. Then came the investors, but initially in small numbers, including Mickey Wolfson, who purchased the fabulous Sterling building on the north side of Lincoln Road and opened a restaurant, The Foundling, there in the mid-1980s. And Mitchell Kaplan, who in the same building, the Sterling building, opened another of his popular books and books stores along with a cafe. By the 1990s, Lincoln Road was exploding in redevelopment as the ripple effect from Ocean Drive and elsewhere swept through it. In recent years, rents there have skyrocketed and pushed out many venerable businesses. Others like Apple, whose initial store at one point had the highest sales per square foot of any Apple store in the world, moved to larger, grander quarters, but insisted on staying on Lincoln Road. And so the store today that they have is about 3 times the size of their initial stores in the northwest portion of that mall. And then there's the area south of 6th Street, known as south of Sobey. How about that area? It was blighted, it was high crime, all the way down to the tip of the island. And again, the ripple effect of the success of Ocean Drive, I think, as well as other parts of the Art Deco district, helped turn around this area that was destined for demolition in the 1970s. And with demolition would have come the dislocation of nearly 7,000 residents, most elderly, under a sincere but misguided Miami Beach Redevelopment Agency, the RDA, effort to create still another Venice of America, with canals, marinas, and townhouses. Today, south of Sobey, since that whole effort was taken apart, south of Sobey offers a smorgasbord of architectural styles, restaurants, and residential towers that attract visitors and residents from all over the world. It is a mix of the old and the new, and somehow seems to be working. Where else will you find the converted synagogue representing the beginnings of Judaism on Miami Beach, today's Jewish Museum of Florida? John, we talked about that at lunch also. With Prime 112, just a few blocks away. Or Nikki Beach standing across from a former Jewish convalescent center. And then there's Wynwood, which is certainly another great success story when it comes to gentrification, with, of course, some ramifications too. Let's talk about Wynwood, because I think the Wynwood story, and Wynwood would be located, let me just give you a tiny bit of background on it. On our map, Wynwood comes down, these are unofficial boundaries, it's never been incorporated, down to 20th Street on the south, and it's bracketed on the east, I would say, by North Miami Avenue, and on the west by I-95. And on the north, this is very interesting, by 36th Street. We'll explain the different parts of Wynwood very, very shortly. So we've got Wynwood. It was a middle-class white neighborhood created out of farm and undeveloped pine land, essentially in the 1920s. And many of the homes north of 29th Street from that period are still standing. Wynwood began to experience the flight of many residents to the new suburbs in the early post-World War II era. Into their place came a growing Puerto Rican population, especially north of 29th Street. So evident in the institutions, businesses, and open spaces along Northwest 2nd Avenue, north of the street we just mentioned, and nearby areas reflecting their presence. Since the 1920s, but especially in the last half of the 20th century, a rising garment district, also known as the Fashion District, appeared along its western sector. So for me, it's long been a tale of 3 cities, the Wynwood area. Some developers and art collectors sensed that the center city neighborhood was ready for redevelopment about 15 years ago. But it was the entrance once again of Tony Goldman and his family as investors a dozen years ago that led to its radical transformation. Tony saw potential in these nondescript 2- and 3-story warehouses, as well as shoe manufacturing plants, that for him spelled human scale and open skies. Art blazed the way, drawing the young, hip, creative types of the neighborhood, followed by other investors and entrepreneurs. But again, as I mentioned before, Wynwood is really the tale of 3 cities, the great art district between Northwest 22nd and 29th Streets, bracketed from I-95 east to North Miami Avenue, where land is selling for high prices, and people who live there have seen their homes razed or converted into the newest art gallery or bar. It is also the old Puerto Rican neighborhood, surprisingly still intact, between 29th Street and 36th Street from North Miami Avenue over to I-95. And finally, it's the Garment District with its large South Korean ownership. Investors and developers continue to salivate over Wynwood, even with the Zika threat. One of the most noteworthy being Buena with his proposed mega development, which as it rises will cover the southern part of the Art District from I-95 east to Northwest 2nd Avenue. What is remarkable about gentrification of Wynwood is how quickly it proceeded after the Goldmans created the Wynwood Walls in 2009, this great art center, art park. And that was before Zika, of course. Thousands of visitors on any given day were there to look at some of this great artwork. And what's also amazing is how unaffected, at least through today, the old Puerto Rican neighborhood is. Today, it's a general Hispanic neighborhood. But from 29th Street to 36th Street, it's like nothing has happened south of it, at least at this point. Surely a tale of three cities. Downtown, the original urban core of Miami, we see it right over here. Now I've got something over here that's pretty high tech. Let's see if we can flash right here. Downtown here, we saw Wynwood before. Let's take a look at downtown. Downtown was ground zero for all things in Dade County well into the post-World War II era. In fact, the busiest intersection in the entire county into the 1950s was today's Miami Avenue and Flagler Street. I'll show you how things have changed in that period of time. But its fall by the beginning of the 1970s was precipitous, a victim primarily of the explosive growth of suburbia, which drew residents and professionals and businesses away from the center. And as institutions and people and businesses moved out, other businesses struggled to stay going. And the historic quarter took on a forlorn air after 6 o'clock as the story went from the 1970s almost up to the present. It was closed downtown. Crime rose as to the public's perception, a growing perception that was, of downtown as a dangerous place. But downtown's emerging revival, and it's certainly a work in progress today, seen also in other downtowns throughout America, has included a swelling residential base, a boulevard on its eastern flank now filling with destinations, from an arena to a performing arts center to museums to beautiful waterfront parks, which are again venues for a variety of activities. The residential breakthrough for downtown came with the success of Jorge Perez's One Miami in the early 2000s. About 2002, he put everything up for pre-construction sale and prices, and he sold out. Followed by the construction of other residential towers along Biscayne Boulevard. But there has also been a failure so far of quality retail and restaurants following the movement of people residentially into downtown. Many believe, however, these businesses are not far behind. One of the factors attracting residential developers to downtown is the presence of a growing transportation system with buses, trolleys, Metro Rail, Metro Mover, and the upcoming Miami Central Train Depot, which will have a tri-rail coming right into downtown Miami, connecting with points north. Some developers are counting on millennials to fill new towers, either recently completed like Centro at about 45 stories on Southeast 1st Street and 2nd Avenue, or on the drawing board, and who will be willing to forego these millennials automotive transportation while relying instead on the aforementioned modes as well as bicycles. Gentrification downtown has not resulted in displacement of people since so few people lived downtown at the time these two booms began and took place. Let's look at Brickell. So we're looking at an area just south of downtown and south of the Miami River. And of course, it has an amazing story too. And these stories of gentrification, they might follow these broad outlines we've talked about, but they all have their own unique characteristics. Let's look at the Brickell Avenue neighborhood. One of the most spectacular venues for the two booms of this young century is Brickell. And it too exhibits different characteristics of the gentrification story. The Brickell Avenue neighborhood was known until recent decades as Southside, and even earlier was often called South Miami. A beautiful residential neighborhood began to emerge amid the remnants of the beautiful hardwood hammock that graced the area south of the river in the 1910s and 1920s. Wood frame homes dotted the area between Southwest 2nd Avenue and Brickell Avenue. By the 1970s and 1980s, several blocks of them had been raised, as if developers looking into their crystal balls saw already the colossal changes that were coming in the early 2000s. Mary Brickell Village and the continuing building in the area around the village have made it one of the area's most popular restaurants and night spot destinations. The colossal development of Brickell, offering towering condos by mega developers like Hugo Colombo and Jorge Perez, make that neighborhood one of the most intensely developing areas in the eastern United States. And this development has resulted in an east and west Brickell, with metro rails right-of-way representing the line of division between the two parts of Brickell. Gentrification in East Brickell, at least in its residential dimension, meant building on an almost clean slate. But West Brickell, a neighborhood of fading 20s era masonry homes immediately east of I-95, with new construction threatening to spill over to the neighborhood beyond or west of I-95, has been replaced by these homes by mid and high rises in one of the most startling transformations in any neighborhood, as developers moved in waving sizable amounts of money in front of homeowners in this one-time forgotten neighborhood. And then there's Little Havana. Now let's take a look at Little Havana here. Everybody's familiar with it. Get my magical lantern on here. Well, we've either run out of juice or I'm not quite doing this right. Let's see. Let's go ahead and just point it out then on the map if we can. Little Havana, of course, is a very large, almost amorphous area stretching from the river west is probably as far as anybody can go, and then on the north-south basis, the river in the north, and at least Carlway in the south, some would argue US 1 in the south. So we've got at least three of the borders of it. That western border just goes out forever in Little Havana. Well, owing to its close proximity to the Brickell Avenue neighborhood, downtown, close to there, its famed colorful Cayocho, its main street, and the Miami River, Little Havana is attracting a bevy of developers who are deeply interested in it. Furthermore, it's proven to be attractive to young professionals as well as workers in general, unable to afford the steep prices of Brickell Avenue neighborhood rents. Little Havana differs, however, from other neighborhoods in many ways. One of these differences stems from a small but spirited advocacy group that has, through a vocal social media campaign, held off something called upzoning, or raising the height of buildings in the eastern edges of East Little Havana. Another difference is the amount of its century-old housing stock straddling West Flagler Street, both north and south of that main street, and immediately west of the Miami River, as far west as 17th Avenue. Even with this opposition, Little Havana, along with Overtown, stands in the crosshairs of redevelopment, with the potential for nefarious results for a large number of renters, small businesses, and institutions. Already large, more modest parcels of land along Cayocho are being, quote, land banked, are being held out of market as their price appreciates before sale or development takes place upon them. And that's really one of a couple of different definitions of land banking. Little Havana is blessed with some enlightened investors and developers that, unlike other neighborhoods in transition, are holding out for a broad variety of businesses and institutions and are committed to historic preservation. The most obvious of gentrification areas in Little Havana would be the old Shenandoah neighborhood, carved out of farmland and undeveloped land during the boom era of the 1920s. Grand homes in the Mediterranean style of architecture dot the neighborhood, standing between Cayocho and Carl Way and between Southwest 12th Avenue and Southwest 27th Avenue. Homes selling in the neighborhood for about $150,000 30 years ago are now listed at or beyond $500,000. North of Cayocho and across from Shenandoah is the old Riverside neighborhood with its plethora of apartments and little evidence of gentrification, a blessing to renters living there. The preponderance of whom, of course, are Hispanic, many of them recent arrivals. But even this picture is beginning to change. Earlier this year, 2016, a two-story apartment building on the eastern edge of Riverside, East Little Havana, that'd be close to the river, sold for $855,000 or $205 per square foot, a record square foot price for a building in Little Havana built before 1980. In 2004, that same property sold for $440,000. Real estate website Zillow puts the average monthly rent of Little Havana at about $1,520 for an apartment, up more than 9% of the figure for last year, 2015. Nearby the above-noted complex near the Miami River, decorated preservationist and entrepreneur Abra James of Vagabond Hotel fame purchased in 2015 the nearby Miami River Inn for $8.6 million from its owner, a Latin American investor who had purchased it just 2 years earlier for about $4.5 million. Sure signs that the Miami River, long a working river, but a stream whose banks are not supportive of commercial businesses like restaurants, has now changed significantly as food emporia along with tall condo complexes have arisen in impressive fashion along this river. And then there's Overtown, just north of downtown Miami. We can see where the American Airlines range is, move west, of course, from there, but in that same trajectory, we'll see Overtown. Founded in the city's birth year, 1896, Overtown, known initially as Colored Town, was a proud, self-contained neighborhood despite the sting and insidiousness of segregation and discrimination. Overtown's population reached nearly 35,000 in 1960, but that decade proved to be calamitous for the community's fortunes, as expressway construction and ill-conceived urban renewal programs helped to gut it. As recently as 2010, the community counted a little more than 9,500 residents, with wide open spaces where buildings once stood. This in a city with one of the highest levels of vacant public housing in the nation. One advocate for public housing, a member of Power Youth Center for Social Change, an advocate group for empowering minorities in a host of ways, maintained at the time, quote, there were over 41,000 people on Miami-Dade's housing assistance wait list. Meanwhile, the Board of County Commissioners is allowing many of these public housing units to remain vacant for 5 years or more. They do not want to address or solve this gentrification and housing crisis, end quote. In 2010, more than 50% of Overtown's residents were living in poverty. Median family income is just over $14,000 annually, and approximately 90% of its residents were renters. From its early decades onward, Overtown, then called Colored Town, was considered expendable if an onrushing downtown began moving north. George Merrick, the sanctified creator of Coral Gables, chaired way back in 1935 a county planning board that was looking at the future of Dade County. And it discussed at those meetings the expendability of Colored Town when downtown's expansion resumed at the end of the Great Depression. That day has arrived. Today, the eastern edge of Overtown is ringed by public buildings, while the southern tier along Northwest 2nd Avenue is the venue for, among other things, a high-rise, market-rate office residential building, which will include a public supermarket on its ground floor. And developers have land banked choice properties near the historic heart of Overtown. Land bank in this case meaning, again, buying them, sitting on them, waiting for value to keep rising, and then decide what to do with them. In the meantime, vertical housing towers, their financing assisted by funds from the Community Redevelopment Agency, the CRA, are rising in the community, representing the first substantial building in Overtown in decades. Let's move north of Overtown into the Buena Vista Design District. Just look above Wynwood and you can see 195 there and State Road 112. Well, Design District Buena Vista would be from roughly 36th Street north to about 48th Street, and then over to Biscayne Bay, west to I-95. Let's look at Buena Vista Design District. Buena Vista Design District are abutting neighborhoods that at one time were almost indistinguishable from one another. Buena Vista's roots harken to the 1880s as a farming community began to develop along the shores of beautiful Biscayne Bay, in the vicinity of today's Northeast 36th to 38th Streets. By the 1920s, an impressive residential neighborhood was rising north of Northeast 41st Street, while a business district appeared south of there, the heart of what was called Buena Vista, which was briefly incorporated as a town in 1924-25. With the opening in that era of T.B. Moore's furniture building on Northeast 2nd Avenue and 40th Street, something called Decorators Row, featuring interior design businesses, was launched. It would segue into the design district by the 1970s. By the late 1980s, the design district was floundering, setting the stage for Craig Robbins, who experienced great success with the turnaround of the Art Deco district, to launch a buying spree by the 1990s of numerous properties in the design district. 20 years later, this transformed district now offers an array of high-end stores on a par with the fabled Bal Harbor shops. Art has also come to the quarter. Next year, the Institute of Contemporary Art will open on the northern flank of the resuscitated design district. The homes north of there have experienced careful restoration work and have risen steeply in value, while restaurants now ring the neighborhood's eastern flank. Will gentrification creep far enough north to salvage the fortunes of something like Archbishop Curley Notre Dame High School and other places that themselves have really experienced shifting demographic changes and a drop in enrollment? Let's look at Little Haiti. And we're defining Little Haiti as north of 54th Street, actually moving as far north as today's North Miami Beach, flanked in the east by clearly Biscayne Boulevard and the west by I-95. Little Haiti, so named by Victor Just, a successful Haitian businessman and community activist in the late 1970s, as Haitians were fleeing the poorest country in the hemisphere and pouring into the old Lemon City neighborhood, filled in the vast vacancies left by the great white flight of the 1960s and 1970s. Slowly and painstakingly, these folks built a community, again, stretching from 54th North up into the Little River neighborhood initially, and that would be the area above Little Haiti up to 79th Street, which is 934, that road there. Moving there and eventually into North Miami and North Miami Beach. The western border, as I mentioned before, was I-95. The old Lemon City downtown became Little Haiti's retail center, and is still very much there and doing pretty well. The Notre Dame High School for Girls, which had opened up in 1953 on 62nd Street Northeast 2nd Avenue, which shut down in the 1970s upon its merger with Archbishop Curley, and that now became Notre Dame de Haiti Catholic Parish, and included a house of worship, initially in the old school cafeteria, social services, and daycare. Gentrification of the old neighborhood, like every other neighborhood we've talked about, has had dissimilar characteristics. The first phase, I think, of Little Haiti, the former Lemon City, which goes back to the 1860s and 70s, was what I would call ethnic gentrification. Haitian immigrants revitalizing, or at least stabilizing, a foundry neighborhood. Now the neighborhood is on the cusp of a second gentrification led by the appearance of a new cultural center, the reopening of the Caribbean marketplace, and the influx of new businesses and artists who are relocating from elsewhere because of greater affordability in this community. Still, its economy remains fragile. On the plus side, a man named Mark Charnitz chased away from the burgeoning Edgewater, a neighborhood southeast of Little Haiti, because of a tripling on the rent in his restaurant space, bought a building on the southern edge of Little Haiti for what he described as a song, and opened earlier this year Philly Grub, making authentic cheesesteaks, if that's possible outside of Philadelphia. I have, since I'm the son of two Philadelphians, I would never think about eating a Philly cheesesteak outside of Philadelphia, but I've been tempted because these guys are bringing in the rolls from Philadelphia, which is one of the keys to the whole thing. So if you see me there sometime, don't hold it against me. There's been a lot of thought going into this. We'll see what happens. Since then, and since he made his purchase earlier in the year, land prices and rents have risen sharply in Little Haiti. Square foot rates in Little Haiti now stand at about $40 per square foot for commercial rentals. Displacement is not yet an issue in Little Haiti because it has continued to expand in a northeasterly direction, moving into other neighborhoods north and northeast of there from its original settlement. But investors are all over the place anticipating a bright future through new developments. Already 2 trailer parks have closed, one of which is now a city park. On the eastern edge of Little Haiti stands a unique example of gentrification. It focuses on a commercial area that was vibrant in the 1950s with office supply stores and tire stores, among other businesses, but was dormant by the 1980s, an area that would be bracketed by 54th Street Northeast on the south, Biscayne Boulevard on the east, moving up to maybe about 60th Street on the north, and the railroad tracks, which would be a little bit west of the Fifth Avenue corridor. Enter Mark Soika, of restaurant fame, a nearby resident, he lives in Morningside, who saw a promising future as a dining district in these shut down stores. Today, numerous restaurants still fill the confines of the old stores. Next up will be the conversion of a venerable pump house that's at about 60 of the 61st Street in Northeast Fifth Avenue. It's a place that as recently as 20 years ago had no roof and probably 100 tires in the back that people had dragged from different places. It's going to become another eatery run by Mark Soika. And then there's Little River again being north of Little Haiti up to 79th Street. You can make a strong case that it goes all the way up to El Portel on our map. Let's look at Little River. It was an early 20th century farming community immediately north of Little Haiti that segued into a residential neighborhood with retail along busy northwest-northeast 79th Street and major north-south streets such as Northwest 2nd, Northeast 2nd Avenues. 2 years ago, I received a call from Father Christopher Moreno, the young dynamic rector of St. Mary's Cathedral Parish, which is the seat of the Archdiocese of Miami, which claims more than 1 million worshipers. We went to lunch in the Design District, and he asked for suggestions on how to grow his most important parish church, since it sits in a very challenged area, one of visual blight, old homes carved up into rooming houses, and plenty of warehouses looking out over the old east-west position FEC railway tracks. I suggested that this young dynamic priest hang on because gentrification was coming, moving north quickly from Wynwood and elsewhere, and that already some artists had moved into some of the warehouses. Further, Averett James and other accomplished preservationists were purchasing properties west of the boulevard into Little River and south of up 79th Street. As this process accelerates, there is again the very real painful prospect of displacement of a population heavily Haitian. And then there's the MIMO district, a term for Miami modern or mid-century modern architecture, a lot of glass and other design elements. One of the most exciting tales of historic preservation and its positive commercial ramifications is that of the MIMO district, a local historic district so declared by the city's Historic Preservation Board in 2006. It stretches along both sides of Biscayne Boulevard from 77th Street down to 50th Street. As noted, the gentrified neighborhoods along the corridor exemplify so much of what gentrification is about and provide a strong market for a myriad of businesses, especially those dealing with food items. Rents have risen sharply in these businesses, so much so that even the most accomplished of them face challenges. This problem was on display when in May of 2016, local celebrity chef and MIMO district resident Michelle Bernstein closed her Center restaurant after a 10-year run, when the new owners of the host building raised her rental price nearly threefold to almost $60 a square foot. For Bernstein, the soaring rental price and the subsequent closing of Center was, in her words, devastating. And I quote her further, we totally vested ourselves in that neighborhood. End quote. You should note that Bernstein, along with her husband, is also a chef, Douglas Martinez, had closed her popular Senora Martinez restaurant in the Design District several years earlier after rents rose there from $15 a square foot to nearly $50 a square foot from one lease to the next. Bernstein's plight, of course, dramatized the two-edged sword that gentrification can be. Allapattah. Look at the area of Allapattah, roughly, and again, this would be a very subjective definition, I would say from either Northwest 7th Avenue or Northwest 12th Avenue, as far west as 27th Avenue, from the river in the south up to perhaps State Road 112, which would be about 38th Street. Next up for gentrification is Allapattah, said to be a Native American term for alligator, possessing rich soil and abutting the winding Miami River on its southern flank. Allapattah was farmland until the great real estate boom of the mid-1920s, when it settled into a middle-class residential neighborhood with a flourishing retail area along Northwest 36th Street and to a lesser degree 17th Avenue. In fact, even as late as the 1950s, there was some farming going on in this community. The white flight altered significantly the demographics of Allapattah, while the rise of a massive civic center and giant health district on its eastern flank brought thousands of workers and visitors to that quarter. In recent decades, Allapattah has become increasingly Hispanic, with the fastest growing group being Dominicans. And surprisingly, given its center city location, the neighborhood was passed over in terms of gentrification. No more. For a giant retail residential area is expected to rise soon along the Miami River, again its southern boundary, and realtors are involved in a busy sales market. According to Carlos Fausto Miranda, one of the busiest property brokers in Allapattah, investors are quietly planning projects in Allapattah, and his firm will, by the end of October 2016, have closed on nearly $50 million in property sales in just 3 months' time. One of Wynwood's largest private art galleries is moving into a newly renovated complex, in fact, in Allapattah. And now property prices are beginning to rise quickly in this neighborhood that combines picturesque royal palms flanking Juan Pablo Duarte Park on 17th Avenue south of 28th Street and junkyards and auto repair shops across the street. So let's conclude. Where do we stand then as a community that has been embroiled in two massive real estate booms while center city, inner city neighborhoods have began to be converted into coveted entertainment and residential destinations? Where with respect to these neighborhoods? Well, let's look at some of the ramifications, both positive and negative here. Some of the negative ramifications of gentrification amid all this building, displacement, which we've mentioned, rising prices, land banking, erasing community history. Some of the positives, the dynamism and resilience of Greater Miami. A building surge has brought jobs. Old areas are enhanced by new construction and residents, in some cases made safer by more police patrol. And Greater Miami remains a lure to deep-pocketed Latin American investors. The rejuvenation of center city neighborhoods have added to the allure and richness of a city some believe is among America's most beguiling. Challenge. The goal of good gentrification is to maintain a racially and economically diverse neighborhood as it undergoes change. This is still to be seen if this goal can be even partially achieved among some of these neighborhoods. Prospects for the future. This strong eastward ho trend, and that's what they used to call it, trying to bring people back into the center city, will continue as traffic becomes unbearable, in part because of development, and these center city neighborhoods will become more alluring to many, especially the young and restless, that are driving so much of this redevelopment. And always there's a sobering reality of the county's shortage of public housing, a chronic problem for tens of thousands of applicants searching for it. There's no quick fixes here. Thank you. We'll open the floor to questions. If anybody has questions at this point. Anybody? Yes,
You just talked about this, the magnet of the east now,
Right.
eastward ho.
Right.
Any comment on what this means for the UDD? Pressure on the UDD?
Well, it's interesting. The UDB, the urban boundary, which has been set by the county commission and is kind of renewed or at least reconsidered every X number of years, about 6 years. The pressure has come from, the big chains and big developers and what have you. I don't know what it's going to do. I think that suburbia is going to continue to grow as more and more people flood to the area. We have more than 2.7 million people today. We had just 1 million people in 1962, just 2 million people in 1994. So it continues to grow very quickly. I think population growth and developers salivating over the next big development are really the people putting the pressure on the UDB. I'm not sure what impact this would have on it, but I think clearly a lot of people, if they had their druthers, economic and otherwise, would like to live in some of these new center or these restored center city neighborhoods. It's convenient to everything. Questions you might have? Questions? Yes, Brian?
So I'm with a group called the Dr. Antonio Jorge Social and Economic Development Council, which is an official advisory body to the county commission.
Mm-hmm.
And for the last several months, we've been working on an idea having to do with the health district around Jacksonville
Right.
Hospital and Alapata. And he told me several things which I hadn't known about Alapata previously, but it seemed to us that it would be possible to put a lot more activities in the health district, including maybe some research by FIU, some research institutes that the state or local government might support. So there'd be more people working in that area, and then having workforce housing in Alapata, especially the southern part of Alapata, that would serve that. And so that would be an extra boost besides all the boosts you're already talking about in terms of Alapata developing a lot. I've driven around a lot in Alapata, and there's a lot of houses there which are quite nice and trees, but there's also some very dilapidated places, and I think it would be possible to have a lot of renovation of fairly decent housing, and then building new, say, mid-rise kinds of. Right.
Well, that early housing stock in the 20s is pretty much intact there because it hasn't been redeveloped, and it's always been a mystery to me because you do have apartment complexes on the west side of the hospital civic center area, the immediate west side, that have been developed over the last 40 to 45 years, especially in recent times, but nothing west of there. In other words, that the western redevelopment area doesn't go much beyond about maybe 14th, 15th Avenue, and then it stops, and then you're back to that old housing. I mean, the proximity of that to the health district is absolutely amazing, as well as to the civic center. A friend of mine was a developer. He built this mid-rise condo complex in 1980-81 called River Run, immediately west of 17th Avenue on the north bank of the river. He said, A, the river's coming back. He was way ahead of his time on that. And B, this will serve the health district, what I'm building. But neither materialized. I mean, he sold out, but it was a lot of people who weren't associated with that. It's always been a mystery to me. Is it the fear of crime, the misperception of crime? I don't know what it is there, but the health district, by and large, is a ghost town after 6 p.m. And yet it employs so many workers during the course of the day. But I just see Allapattah, because the bargains are still there compared with so many other of these center city neighborhoods, as really the next frontier. It's close to everything. It's got the highway system there. It's got the river there. We have the fifth busiest. Pardon me? Metro Rail's right there. The Allapattah station, Santa Clara station. That's one reason why it's either Margulies or the other large art collector in Wynwood, whose name escapes me right now. They've moved to a warehouse. It's a massive building there, in part because the Santa Clara Metro Rail station is right there. Rubel. It's either one or the other, Margulies or Rubel. I just can't remember which one. I think it's Rubel. But again, that transportation, it's all there. So it's waiting to happen. I make my living, as you do, Brian, looking at the past. I guess if we were more future-oriented, we could have been wealthy by now. But if I was going to invest in something, if I had the money to invest, I would buy real estate in Allapattah. Because I really think it's the coming turnaround neighborhood. Interesting place. Yes, huh?
Thanks so much for your comprehensive talk.
Thank you.
I feel like such a large issue in each of these communities has to do with who can access, like who owns land.
Mm-hmm.
And we are living increasingly in a renter-based society, and Miami's deep inequalities are in terms of wealth, and that's a lot, largely based in terms of who actually owns property. So I wonder, thinking about moving forward and how we shape gentrification in more ethical and just ways. It seems that the politics over land and who has access to land and who's lived on land for a long time seems to be not really part of that conversation as much as it needs to be, and the sort of sweep of development and how easy it is for developers to acquire land is just kind of easy in facilitating this.
Well, it really is. It's so market-driven, this whole thing. It's, again, if you looked at the phases or the way I discussed the Art Deco District, the way it kind of came together, it was really interesting. You had some creative types and, pretty countercultural thinking. But some of the later gentrification we talked about has really been market-driven. Investors coming in, this is a good buy now, I can sit on it, it's going to really appreciate in value as more come. We were talking at lunch today, John, myself, and several other people. Now that you've got high ground in Liberty City and relatively high ground in Little Haiti, and you're looking at sea level rise and all, I mean, in the years and decades to come, you're going to have to move inland if you're going to survive here. And so we're beginning to hear reports that a lot of those areas are being bought up too, without any development now. They've been land banked in a different way. A buddy of mine who's and it doesn't answer your question, but I'm going to come back to it in a second. A buddy of mine who has a lot of property in Little Havana, and he was described by a banker friend of mine as a developer with a conscience, a guy named Bill Fuller. He told me a couple of years ago that virtually everything that's east of I-95 from the Brickell Avenue neighborhood all the way past Little Haiti and the Little River's already been purchased in anticipation of all these changes coming. And he's got his ear to things, but he owns so many properties. But getting back to what you're saying, I've read a book by N.D.B. Connolly, who's a black historian, and a lot of y'all know it, A World More Concrete. It's a very complicated book. And the thesis is that who owns the land dictates virtually everything. And he has studied, in particular, Overtown and Liberty City, and the small percentage of people there that actually own the land that they live on, and how problematic that really is. And each of these neighborhoods has a whole different basis. The small groups in Overtown have taken pretty brave stands against some of those big developments are really, I think, to be admired. But it's also a very challenging situation for them to be successful.
And so much stuff, the stuff is under the radar screen, unless you're studying property sales and, tax assessors, rolls and all, you're probably not even aware of these things.
Well, there's one of the guys that bought so much of that core property in Overtown's historic district, lives on Miami Beach, and he's a major developer. So, the ways in which someone can kind of sweep in and, just acquire.
They have the money and they wave it there. It's kind of hard to stop something like that. It really is. I mean, there's some things we can do. Declare something in a historic district, which doesn't guarantee that demolition won't occur, but it can discourage things. But we've been real slow. I served on the city's preservation board for 4 years in the 80s. I've been on the county's preservation board for more than 19 years, and we move slowly. It's hard to explain. Got to have the studies done, and then they bring in the attorneys, and they'll fight this, and it's a long process. Wears you out after a while. That's why I'm glad to be here in academia right now. So I really didn't answer your question, but I agree with you on that. That I'm not sure there's really an answer. Because we're dealing with market forces, we're dealing with society where if you make an offer for a parcel of land and somebody wants to sell it to you, in most cases that sale will be consummated. And how do you stop something like that to preserve something? And the overview of Overtown was a very quick synopsis. I've studied in detail for about 40 years what's happened there, its development and the problems that it's experienced, and not just the expressway and urban renewal, but absentee ownership and bonded rental agency, which owned I don't know how many thousands of units there. It just goes on and on and on. Yes, huh?
I have a question, I guess a general question. The investors come into a neighborhood like Wynwood or Miami Beach because they see it growing and flourishing, so they want to invest, and then eventually they want to make a profit off of it. But it's like, gentrification is good because it does, I guess, improve the look and the economy as a whole. It adds to the economy, GDP and all
Right.
that. So it's not bad.
No,
but
we looked at the good and bad. We looked at the
Right.
positive and negative on it, and just to jump in for a second, hey, it's exciting what's happening in Wynwood. Who would have imagined going over there 15 years ago for a beer or see artwork? It just wasn't happening. It's very exciting.
But there's people who live in those neighborhoods who live there for a long time, and in those neighborhoods they probably created their own culture.
Right, and we
stuff
talked about that too.
So it's like, how do you, not bother them, leave them there with their culture and all
Right.
that stuff, but still improve on the city. You know what I mean? Doing
That's been the $64 challenge. If possible, keep that culture from being destroyed through displacement. But can they afford to remain there is a problem, because as the value goes up, the taxes go up, the rents go up, the prices of houses go up and all too.
where do they, for example, in Coconut Grove, when
Yes.
you go to Coconut Grove,
And I purposely stayed away from the Grove,
yeah,
which is interesting. And I love the Grove. I conduct tours of it half forever. I stayed away because gentrification there is a completely different animal. Much of the Grove wasn't blighted. And so when people moved in, they took a place that was already viable, trees everywhere, and they might have added this touch or that touch to it. But the great irony is that the development of these neighborhoods, the gentrification here, has drawn so much of the action away from the Grove that the Grove some nights looks like a ghost town. It's centered. It used to be the only place you could get out and walk in Miami.
but they say that, when you're driving to the Grove, there's an immediate change from the neighborhood, and then if you cross a CVS, and it's completely different. And I hear that they're trying to basically throw.
Well, we're talking about Grand Avenue, I think, but also some other avenues in the West Grove, the Black Bahamian Grove, which is probably has been the most stable ethnic neighborhood in all of greater Miami, just sitting down for a few minutes. And what you found on the Grand Avenue corridor, and Grand Avenue was in many ways gutted. The riots took the toll on it in '68 and in '80, and you had a lot of owners who fled at that point, and it was gutted, and there's been a lot of money put into it, a lot of internal improvements done, infrastructure, what have you. But Bank of America's moved in, CVS has moved in, who knows who else is coming. Charles Avenue, which is arguably the most historic street in the Grove. On the sides of it now, you're seeing gentrification. It's traditionally been a black Bahamian street, but now white developers have moved in on both ends. Not in a large way, but have moved in. And that represents a problem too, I think, for the people living there.
Yeah, like, I wonder where these people who are basically moved out, like, where they go. I feel like these people are constantly cycling through Miami.
That's the question, and it's interesting because as early as the '60s, model city programs were in Brownsville, which had been a more rural area, black area, that abuts Liberty City, but also there was a lot of public housing and subsidized housing in some of the faraway communities like Carroll City. Liberty City is Liberty City in large measure because of the construction of Liberty Square in 1937. That's when it opened, a black public housing project, the second oldest public housing project in the country, but also because so many people in the classic and the most discouraging example of what you and I are talking about, of course, is Overtown, the displacement of thousands of people. Population statistics, once again, 34,000 plus in 1960, 9,500 in 2010. So what happened to the 30,000? Well, many of them went to Liberty City, but it was very difficult. And Liberty Square took in a lot of them, but and the concrete monsters went up. And again, this is a whole other lecture we're talking about. The greatest story in terms of assisting people who in some ways were victimized by the turnaround of districts is the Deco District, in large measure because of Harvard Capital, where a lot of the elderly weren't displaced. And the worst story, the saddest story, is Overtown, with the construction of I-95, urban renewal, just level blocks away from I-95. And you see what happened there is unreal.
And those people basically are forced to move out because they don't own the land, they rent it, and
Well, not even if they owned it through eminent domain, they had to sell it.
they're forced to sell it because of.
Through eminent domain, it was condemned by the state and the county.
So
for
if
construction.
the state or the county says, I want to build a highway here, you guys have to move, they
Yeah.
have to move.
In most cases, yes. Many went to court, and most of them lost their cases.
And where do they expect those people?
And that was the problem. We've been way behind in terms of building affordable housing. We talked about 41,000 in 2010 on a waiting list in Miami-Dade County.
Yeah, I hear Miami is like, the worst city to live in because it has very high poverty levels.
And also the rental rate is so high. It's
Right, the mixture of.
some studies have indicated that more than 40% of a person's income in some of these areas goes to rent. There's not a lot left for other things.
So it's just like.
Yeah, I guess, it's hard for me to proffer solutions, but it's also hard for public officials to proffer solutions to these problems. So far, it really hasn't happened. Tom?
Some of the impact that we're seeing today in our community is due to the poor public transportation.
Yeah, yes it is.
If they fix that, many other things will fall
They
into
will.
place.
People can truck to work and,
I live a mile away from here. I spent more time trying to find parking in this complex than it took me to get from my house to here. So,
well,
and I could have easily jumped on, and once I was here, I said, well, why didn't I take an Uber? It would have been easy. Finding parking here is ridiculous, and I haven't been on this campus probably in 20 years.
well, I looked for 20 minutes and thank God for John's assistant, Jeanette. She finally got me a place, but no, and public transportation has been a problem, and buses in particular have been a problem. Inadequate service, not reliable in terms of times. We've got a huge problem. We're a very sprawling county. We're a new county. Actually, we were founded in 1836, but we had less than 900 people in 1890, so we're a new county. And it's a county built around the automobile. And because of that, we don't have New York's trains, obviously. Furthermore, you couldn't put them underground anyway. The water table's too high. So, obviously, we surface, but we don't have it. It's, there's a lot of thought that goes into this topic, not because me or I present it, it has nothing to do with me, But it's a fascinating topic, and there's a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of positive things, but there's also a lot of challenges for people, negative things. And we're talking about a population, a large population that is really being bedeviled by this.
I submit to you, 40 years ago, when I was going to Miami-Dade South, I was having to take a bus into the Four Gables bus station, transfer out of there to go to Miami-Dade South. Living in the same location, 1 mile east of here. This campus did not exist
Yeah.
at the time. It took me nearly 3 hours to do that little commute. And it doesn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense 40 years ago,
Yeah.
and no one has awakened to the fact that it doesn't make any sense today.
Right. Absolutely.
Navigate South End campus?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Well, they call it the Kendall campus now. Yes, sir.
You mentioned developers, they buy a lot, I guess, and they'll sit on it.
Yeah, but they can do that, and we see it along Coyocho and Little Havana. I live there and I walk it every day, and so I've got a good sense of it. And Tom's over there, he's seen a lot of the same stuff I've seen. Yeah.
I'm not too well versed, but I can't imagine that local residents in the Phil's community, they want to see that. Do they?
They don't want, they want,
They don't want to see just like empty lots there.
no, of course not.
So is there any, like, as far as policy goes, is there any way to incentivize or
Well, it's very interesting, and I raised it in my remarks, that there's a small group of real strong defenders of Little Havana trying to maintain it as it is today. Been very vocal, use social media very well, but they really haven't addressed that area. And they started leveling large amounts of land during the last boom, and then that boom collapsed by about 2006, and nothing happened. And now this boom has come, and now it's going, and nothing's happened. I don't know what they plan to do with it.
Yes, I was wondering, is there like no way for, I don't know, local policymakers to disincentivize that kind of like practice?
I don't know how. You really can't penalize somebody, and you raise taxes, but it has to be across the board. It can't be just on one property. And it's a market situation. I've got money. I want to buy this. You want to sell it to me? Well, I'm going to buy it from you. So it's a little more difficult. Yes, sir.
Yes, kind of related to this issue and some of the other questions, if you've heard about any other, a different kind of land banking, or land grabbing, I think is another term that's used, where like a nonprofit developer, a land grabber, a land banking specifically for affordable housing.
Right, and that has happened, and that's a great point. I had mentioned earlier there are many definitions of land banking, and that's a great point. And there has been an effort, I'm not sure how far it's gotten, to land bank in the most positive way, like you said, to set it aside for the community in some way. Let's just say a park, or something like that, in Overtown. But again, Overtown's very small, because it's been eaten up by so much of the highway system and everything else.
Right.
But yes, and that is I don't think that avenue of land banking has really been visited that much in Dade County, but it has happened in a lot of communities.
And just a follow-up, maybe one comment and a question on Overtown too. I loved your talk and everything, very informative. But the phases of gentrification, one that I would add, throwing from the sociological literature at the very beginning is neglect that's emphasized before kind of the rents are low.
Sure.
There's decades of neglect
Of
that
course.
kind of prepare a lot of these neighborhoods.
Yeah, and that's it. It's a given, but you're right. That is really phase one. And I kind of implied it with the Art Deco District. Barbara Kappenman, her husband had an appointment at FIU in the early 70s, and they had honeymoon there in 1938. They came from New York, and she wandered over in the mid-70s at the latest to where they had honeymoon in the South Beach. And she said, oh my God, and she had an artistic background. All these great buildings, nobody else saw them as great, are still standing. These are my words. I got to do something to preserve these. And so, again, she takes this famous walk with one of her sons and Leonard Horowitz, and then she organized the Miami Design Preservation Lake. Well, the implication there, of course, is they were really down on their heels, those buildings. Just like Wynwood was down on its heels. They had a downtown area that wasn't flourishing, but it was still around in the 1980s. It was gone by the 1990s, which was probably its nadir as a neighborhood. You had drug wars going on there. I mean, it was outrageous.
If I could ask just one more
Sure.
question. any thoughts or gossip or crystal ball images of what's going on with Beckham in Overtown in the state?
That's a great question. I don't know, it's at a standstill. I'm not privy to, probably some of the things that are going on right now, but we haven't heard him backing out, but I don't know how many times you're gonna turn this guy away. I mean, this will be probably the last time they turn him away on this, but my hunch is it's gonna go forward. Just my own hunch. Again, it's between the proposed soccer stadium. It's bracketed by Northwest 7th Avenue on the west, about Northwest 5th Avenue on the east, Northwest 6th and 8th Avenues north and south. It's an area that is undeveloped, so to speak. It's an area at one time that was just south of an industrial area. The city of Miami had a transportation authority called Miami Transportation Authority. It's buses, where there was a bus barn. Then the county and HUD had buses there. And then Brickell Beer, which was a local beer manufactured beer, abutting that site. We're talking now the middle decades of the 20th century. And since that time, it's been dormant. Spring Garden, a great neighborhood, which we didn't talk about because it really hasn't undergone gentrification in a classical sense, is immediately east of there, doesn't want it there, obviously, because of no parking garage and there'll be cars all over Spring Garden. I conducted a tour of it, it's a beautiful neighborhood. We didn't talk about that, we didn't talk about the Roads neighborhood, which is a complete aberration. It's one of the few center city neighborhoods I know anywhere in America that never went down the valley after World War II, it just kept going up. Today, houses there fetch as much as they do in Coral Gables. Great neighborhood, and the homes are relatively nondescript. It's just the way it's laid out. So, it's an interesting city. My dad again came from Philadelphia, he's long deceased, and he once told me, it must have been, 30 years ago or so, he said, boy, Miami has so many distinctive neighborhoods. And I always think about what he said, if you could only come back now and see them. Oof. Well, let's take a final question. Anybody? Yes, huh?
One thing that, when I arrived in Miami, I had a kindergartner. And so, prime on my, list of things to look for was the school system. And I think there's been some controversy in some of these gentrifying areas between the established residents and the newcomers over public schools, but you didn't really talk at all about that. I don't know if that's part of it.
Right, I didn't. I thought I had so much stuff in here, I didn't want to go too long. That's a huge issue, and you're beginning to hear a big conversation now in the more richly appointed neighborhoods like Brickell, about more schools, downtown about more schools. Not hearing too much in Wynwood. Wynwood actually has, up until recent times, has more schools than are really needed for its population. It's got a middle school, it's got an elementary school, it's got the Young Men's Prep Academy, 3 schools within less than a mile of one another. And its population north of 29th Street really hasn't ratcheted up. We didn't address schools, but gentrification usually brings a demand for better schools and maybe more schools. It's a very good point on your part. Very good. And we're here in Brickell for sure now, and now downtown too. Those are 2 in particular. I want to thank you all so much for having me here. John, Brian, good to see you.